20 years or so, since we were both undergraduates studying in Paris. He was, both of us, at École Normale, but he was also studying medieval English literature at Paris 4 Sorbonne, and I was studying medieval philosophy at Paris 4 Sorbonne. And we know each other so for quite a long time now. He is professor of English at the University of Cluj, Babes-Bolyai, where he teaches mainly Shakespeare. I've prepared even a PowerPoint to introduce you, Adi.
Not mainly. Oh no, I'm not going to allow that.
No, you have to, because I am
don't
supposed to be the host.
eulogize
You're
me.
supposed to be the co-host.
Let's start ex abrupto, because we have already wasted some time.
That's fine. Look, not my colleagues don't know you actually, so I'd like to introduce to them what you do. It's so Adrian is a specialist in several things, like all eminent scholars. He is mainly working, or lately working, on Shakespeare. He just published 3 books on Shakespeare. Those are the they are to call the viral books, because on the one hand they've been written, or at least published, during the pandemic, the first wave of the pandemic, but they've been also sold very well, a few thousands of copies in a couple of months, so they are indeed viral.
Yes, it's still better than medieval philosophy.
Definitely. So 3 books, and he has a plan, a wonderful plan, to write about all Shakespeare's work, and poetry and drama and everything. He has published also mainly, also, let's say, the second main field that Adrian is working on is medieval manuscripts. He established in 2007 a center for the study of manuscripts entitled Codex. It's based here in Cluj. It's a wonderful center where he also trains people, or he trained several people, and he still trains students in this center. He is the main collaborator of Fragmentarium. He has currently he's leading a project on medieval fragments of manuscripts preserved in Romania, mainly in Transylvania, but not only in Transylvania, but mainly in Transylvania. He has published a book on the like a updated catalog or census of manuscripts preserved in Alba Iulia, and the most important library of manuscripts.
Not only in Alba Iulia, in all of Romania.
In all of Romania, okay. But I know that well, Alba Iulia is mainly the center where the manuscripts are preserved in Romania. And the second book on medieval manuscripts preserved in Romania is currently in press. Is it something that I missed, or I saw the cover?
That's a history of the medieval book. No, all right, let me do it more simply. I started as a scholar of Carolingian manuscripts, and this is what I'm going to entertain you with today. I started with Boethius, with all the early manuscripts of Boethius, with Anglo-Saxon manuscripts, did a PhD on Old English. Then when I came back to Transylvania, decided to work mainly on the local collections. And I think this is only a fair contribution to what we have at home, and which has been exceedingly understudied for the past decade. So we decided to do in this little research center in Cluj some tools, some reference works. We translated the codicological vocabulary by Musrel into Romanian. So now we have a full codicological vocabulary in Romanian. There isn't one in English, I'm afraid. There are others, of course, in English, in French, the original, in Italian, in Spanish, and now in Romanian. So I'm pretty glad that we are the 4th language to have this complete codicological vocabulary. And then we started to do a census of medieval manuscripts in Romania. We had no clue how many there were, and many of them had never been catalogued. Some of them had been, mainly in the late 19th century. So of course we had to go through all of those. They're not very numerous, barely 515 that we have been able to uncover so far. So of course that's much less than any decent early medieval Benedictine abbey. Fleury had much more in the 9th century than we have in the whole country nowadays. But even so, it was even more appalling that they hadn't been described. And now, of course, we should be focusing on doing catalogs. But as we started, of course, we realized that there were considerably more fragments than actual full manuscripts. So we've also started some initiatives of cataloging, digitizing, restoring, preserving fragmenta codicum. I have 180 here in Cluj, but Dragos initially wanted me to talk about the fragmenta codicum in Cluj. I didn't know if that would have interested you philosophers.
We're not only philosophers, it's very broad. So,
yes, most of those are liturgical and late medieval. So it doesn't matter, yeah. I decided, and besides I'm giving a conference on that at Fragmentarium in March, so I decided I would rather talk about my first concern, which is ongoing actually, and that is the tradition of Boethius in the early Middle Ages. It also has a bit of philosophy in it, but mind you, I'm a philologist, so treat me kindly. I'm not an expert in early medieval philosophy, but incidentally, of course, I did have to tackle it as I wrote about Boethius, and as I wrote a dissertation about the idea of fate and providence in Old English literature. This being said,
so now you can share your screen.
Yes, now, and I'm going to mute everybody. That's one of the wonderful prerogatives I have as a host. And of course, any of you can unmute yourselves when needed. Now, my paper, my presentation is actually not so much work in progress as things that I have already gone through. Some of them are new, some I have already written about. And I called it Hic magis philosophicae quam catholice loquitur, quoting a gloss that one can find in several early medieval Boethius manuscripts. And then I intend to speak not only about the Latin tradition or reception of Boethius, but also about the vernacular translations of the Consolation of Philosophy in the early Middle Ages. And although it's called early Middle Ages, I'm going to start with a passage from Chaucer, and I'm going to start with a cock. This is a philosophical cock. Mind you, it's not any other type of cock that you might have in mind. It is a gentle cock. This gentle cock, and of course you realize this is Chanticleer, right? Chanticleer from the French Roman de Renard. And this is what Chaucer tells us about this philosophical cock. This gentle cock, this is Middle English now. This gentle cock had in his governance 7 hennes for to do all his plaisance, of which the fairest hewed on her throat was clapped fair Damoiselle Berthelote. Berthelote, right? That's French. You see, Chaucer is already gouvernance, plaisance, Berthelote. French is as home in Chaucer's Middle English. So this Chanticleer had a nightmare. And so befell that in a Douweninge, this Chanticleer gan groanen in his throat, as man that in his dream is dratched sore. So he had a nightmare and he began to choke. What was that nightmare? That he would be eaten by a fox, obviously. Now, God, quod he, me swevne racke right, and keep me body out of full prison. Me mette ho that I roamed up and down within a 1 yard, which as I saw a beast, was licken hond and wolde han ma de rest upon my body, and wolde han me deed. There was a fox that wanted to kill him, but he had never seen a fox before, so he doesn't know what it is. He just sees a beast in his dream, in his vision, that's going to kill him. And then Berthelot starts comforting him and saying, come on, are you a man? Man, that's what Chaucer uses. Are you afraid of dreams? Go out and start pecking, you know. But this is what he tells her. Madame Berthelote, so have a bliss of all things God hath sent me large grace, for when I see the beauty of your face, it makes all my dread for to die. For also sicker as in principio, mulier est hominis confusio, he says. Madam, the sentence of this Latin is, woman is man's joy and all his bliss, right? Which of course is not the translation of that, as all of you have realized. This is Chaucer. And then he starts explaining to her that if he has seen that, there is a necessity, according to certain clerks, that this must happen. He goes out following. He goes out following Berthelote. The fox comes, picks him. Then the good wife there chases the fox with a broomstick. And now Chanticleer is lecturing his wife Berthelote for having advised him to go down into the yard at his life's peril. Chanticleer accurset be that moro that go into that yard flow from the beamers. Let me modernize. But what that God foreknew must needs be, after the opinion of certain clerks, witness on him that any perfect clerk is, that in schools there is great disputation and has been of 100,000 men. And now I'm going to switch to modern English to make it easier. In this, the grain from chaff I cannot sift, as can the holy Dr. Augustine, Boethius or Bishop Bradwardine, where the gods knowing what our futures bring constrains me so that I must do a thing, by which I mean simple necessity, or whether there is free choice granted me to do the thing or not, though there is naught that God does not foreknow before it's wrought. Of it his knowing constrains not one degree beyond conditional necessity. Can you imagine rhymes on conditional necessity and degree? Very nice, isn't it? But I will have no part of such debate. My tale is of a cock, as I relate, who took his wife's advice to his dismay and walked within the yard that very day, despite what he had dreamt, as I have told. Now, of course, in quoting Bishop Bradwardine and Boethius and all the others, Chaucer knew what he was doing because he had translated Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy into Middle English. And he knew that Boethius wrote, Duae sunt enim necessitates, simplex una veluti quod necesse est, omnes homines esse mortales, altra conditionis, utialique ambulare scias, eum ambulare necesse est, right, with the translation. And in Chaucer's translation, this reads, for certes, there being two manners of necessity, that one necessity is simple, and as thus that it behoves, it must, by necessity, that all men be mortal or deadly. Another necessity is conditional, as thus, if you knew that a man walks, it must, by necessity, he must be walking, right? This is what he's saying in Middle English. Now, this was only the introduction, because actually I'm going to go much further into the past than Chaucer, and I'm going to come back to Chaucer at the end of this presentation. The first question that needs to be settled is when the West rediscovered the Consolation of Philosophy, composed, as you well know, before by Boethius before dying in 524. Perhaps he was at house arrest, not in a prison, as some people believe, where he had his library. The text disappeared until the late 8th century, when Alcuin uses the Consolatio in his De Vera Philosophia. And around 790, but mind you, Alcuin moved from York to France in 781. So he was already in France, I think, when he wrote his De Vera Philosophia, which actually is a discourse between a Frank and a Saxon. So that shows that he was in France already. And around 790, he wrote in his Versus de Sanctis Euboricensis Ecclesiae, he mentioned quae Victorinus scripsere Boethius atque historici veteres. But it's not very clear if he refers to the Consolation of Philosophy or to any of Boethius's translations from Aristotle, as perhaps the juxtaposition with Marius Victorinus seems to suggest. So maybe he was referring to other works than the Consolation of Philosophy as extant at York in the 790s. And there is a great discussion whether the Consolation of Philosophy was known in Anglo-Saxon England, where the one manuscript was extant in Anglo-Saxon England, and Alcuin knew it there, and then he took that knowledge, or perhaps a manuscript or a copy of it, to France, or whether he discovered it in France. My theory is that he discovered it in France, and I wrote an article about it to prove it. The question, of course, is, was the Consolation known in Anglo-Saxon England in the 8th century? If it had been available there, we should suppose that the greatest scholars of Anglo-Saxon England, who are Aldhelm, who died in 709, Tatwin, 734, Bede, 735, knew the Consolation. Fabio Troncarelli from Viterbo argues that they did. My idea is that they didn't, and his evidence is actually not credible. He quotes some very commonsensical things that those authors, he thinks, derived from Boethius, but I think it was common knowledge, or sometimes it was even, I don't know, Virgil rather than Boethius. I wrote about it to confute Troncarelli. Is there any evidence, consequently, of an insular tradition of Boethius? Now, Boethius certainly appears among the Libri Scotice Scripti at St. Gall, which is obviously an Irish foundation in what is today Switzerland, in the Alemannic area. And in the catalog of the St. Gall books, however, from the end of the 9th century, we find Arithmetica Boetii, but not other idea that the Irish or the English knew the Consolatio before it appears in France at the end of the 8th century. My theory is that one influential copy of the Consolation of Philosophy survived in Fleury, Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire, not far from Orléans in central France. Fleury has all the prerequisites for owning a copy of Boethius. First of all, it has an excellent library containing a lot of classics and also patristic authors in the 8th century, as William Traube and Elisabeth Pellegrin have showed. Its scriptorium is certainly better than the scriptorium of Tours, where Alcuin was active in the 8th century, as E.K. Rand has shown. It had, moreover, early medieval, late antique Italian manuscripts, copied from the 5th to the 7th century in important quantities. And even today, Orléans is next to Paris with regard to the number of codices Latini antiquiores. So the greatest number of ancient manuscripts in France comes from Orléans, after Paris, of course. Out of 31 codices Latini antiquiores of Fleury provenance, 25, moreover, are of Italian provenance, copied between the 5th and the 7th century. How did Fleury get its Italian manuscripts at that early stage? Well, they spent a night in Monte Cassino and stole, as you well know, the relics of Saint Benedict himself. I assume that they may also have stolen some books when they did it, together with the relics of Saint Benedict. There are other theories. Bishop, for example, argues that they were the recipients of papal munificence. But I shouldn't imagine why they wouldn't have also left Monte Cassino, which was in a derelict state in the 7th century, with some books as well. So I think that in 703, during the translation of Saint Benedict's relics, some books may have moved as well. It's certain that the abbot of Fleury in 821, the famous Theodulf of Orléans, who is also responsible for the Libri Carolini, was interested in Boethius, whom he actually quotes more often than Alcuin, as Donald Bollow and other scholars argue. So we have a strong case for Fleury. The Consolatio, also Fleury has the oldest copy, the oldest extant copy, I should say, of the Consolatio, Orléans Bibliothèque Municipale Manuscript 270, copied and dated by the prickings, the famous article about prickings by E.K. Rand, dated it around 825. So it's a manuscript from the age of Theodulf, more or less. This is the oldest extant Consolatio manuscript. It certainly follows an ancient edition, as Troncarelli shows. It has the oldest set of glosses, and moreover, in textual terms, the Floriacensis family of the Opuscula Sacra, which very often are transcribed together with the Consolatio Philosophiae in the same manuscripts, are better than the Turonensis family, Tours being, of course, the monastery where Alcuin was active in the late 8th and early 9th century before his death in 804, of course. 4 out of 15 9th century Consolatio manuscript may have been copied in or around Fleury. And Fleury, moreover, had very strong connections with Anglo-Saxon England and also with all the other Carolingian centers. Ferrières, where Lupus of Ferrières had written a metrical commentary on the Consolatio. Auxerre, where later in the 9th century, Remigius of Auxerre wrote a commentary, perhaps the earliest full philosophical commentary, and of course, Tours with Alcuin. Moreover, Fleury had connections to Anglo-Saxon England. We have manuscripts that were copied in Fleury and display insular influence. And also, there were very intense relationships between Fleury and all these centers in Anglo-Saxon England in the 10th century. Now, could the consolation have come from Fleury to Anglo-Saxon England rather than the other way around? This is what I argue in an article I published in Medium Evum, and I think it sticks. I mean, why should they have had a copy in England and then took it to France, and nowadays most copies were made in France? I think it's the other way around. Certainly one extant 9th century manuscript is connected to Anglo-Saxon England, and that is Vatican Latin manuscript 3363, copied also in Fleury in the first half of the 9th century, which bears the first demonstrable connection with Britain. It has Celtic glosses in Cornish, actually, in a Cornish dialect, actually 2 Cornish glosses, written in the margin. Here you can see one of them. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this is Celtic, this is Cornish. And it also has insular glosses in the hand of Saint Dunstan, probably made before he became abbot of Glastonbury, or at that time. We know that in the 9th century, the Consolation of Philosophy was also translated into Old English. Now, how many people and when were engaged with the study of the Consolation of Philosophy? The first generation of scholars, of Carolingian scholars, Alcuin and Theodulf, mentioned the Consolatio as already mentioned. The second generation, under the reign of Louis the Pious, is responsible for the production of the earliest extant manuscripts, Orléans 270 that I already mentioned, around 825. But we don't have any trace of a study, of an actual study of the Consolation of Philosophy. It's the third generation of Carolingian scholars under the reign of Charles the Bald, from 840 to 870, I would say, roughly speaking, of course, and especially Lupus of Ferrières, whose hand is actually identified in the Florentine manuscript from the mid-9th century. Giulio D'Onofrio and John Marenbon argue that even Eriugena wrote a commentary, a lost commentary on the Consolatio Philosophiae. Grimald, abbot of Reichenau and St. Gallen, around 872, mentions the Consolation of Philosophy. And then the earliest instances of a German, Alemannic commentary of, I mean, Latin, but also with vernacular glosses produced in the Alemannic area, start appearing. There's famous St. Gallen family of glosses and commentaries at the end of this period. The fourth generation of Carolingian scholars sees the birth of actual long-running commentaries, Glossicae Circumscriptiones. Remigius of Auxerre, who died in 908, comments on the Consolation. The Old English translation of the Consolation attributed to King Alfred of Wessex, King Alfred the Great, around 899, maybe a bit later, but anyway, it appeared around that period, around 900. And also the already mentioned manuscript 3363 from the Vatican Vatlat 3363 reaches Britain and is glossed in a Celtic hand. Now, I'm not going to bore you to death with all these manuscripts and so on, but it's just to show you how many manuscripts were being copied up to around 900. And if you place them on a map, you will see that actually there are two main areas where manuscripts of the Consolatio were produced. In the area of Fleury, Auxerre, also Long, under Hincma, and of course associated to Scotus, Eriugena, and the others. Tours, just one manuscript with no glosses. Some lost manuscripts, Aachen, Köln, but I think that those two actually come from the Neustrian area. A manuscript that reached Fulda, this is the one from Fleury, which ended up in Florence and is also glossed by Lupus of Ferrières, so that one also comes from here. I think, not from Fulda. It only went from Ferrières to Fulda with Lupus. And then around the Bodensee, around the Lake Constance, several manuscripts, all from St. Gallen, a Munich manuscript, a Naples manuscript, one that is in St. Gallen, and one in Vienna, 271 at the Österreichische Nationalbibliothek. So I think that from around 800 to around 900, the Consolatio was studied in two main areas, Ferrières, Fleury, Auxerre, and St. Gallen, basically. And that's it. The others are accidents, or perhaps they can be connected to those centers, but we don't have enough data yet. Now, what does the tradition look like? It looks like this in the beginning. Look at this early manuscript, copied perhaps in Fulda, but by Lupus, who took it from Ferrières or took it to Ferrières. The first thing you can see in the layout of the manuscript of the page is that no room was left in the margins for glossing. And there is little room left between the lines for glossing as well. Is this a library copy or a personal copy? Here you see the hand of Lupus of Ferrières, which says damnatio vanae gloriae. These are his personal annotations, and I think these are reading notes. As he was reading, he just said, here is something interesting about something that interested him at that moment. In the same manuscript, only the main concepts are sometimes highlighted. Here, for example, you see by a different hand, you see the difference in ink. Providentia fatum, it's the ink that also made this initial here. Providentia fatum. But actually no glossing, no scholarly tradition as yet. In the long manuscript associated, mind you, with Scotus Eriugena, and I also think that Scotus didn't comment on the Consolatio actually, but that's a different discussion and perhaps not for now. There are very rare glosses in this manuscript copied in Long in the age of Jean Scott. As you can see here, there is only one showing some perplexity. It says, Mira de providentia et fato. You see, with an open A yet. Mira de providentia et fato. Something amazing about providence and fate. You can actually see around the same area in manuscripts, in a manuscript that comes from Saint-Germain, but ultimately I think also from Fleury, a copy of an ancient edition that this manuscript actually was also not meant to accommodate scholarship. The fact that the Carmina are written in Capitalis Rustica also seems to Troncarelli to imitate, to come from an ancient tradition. But as you can see, there is little space left between the lines for glosses, and the very ample, generous margins are there just for decorum, not for glossing. The tradition actually starts with Orléans 270. This is the earliest manuscript showing some consistent glossing, some engagement with the text. And as you can see, there are several hands here, several layers of glosses, which shows successive interest in the Consolatio within successive generations or by different scholars. Some of them have open R's, but this one is obviously later. This one is obviously earlier. You can see here the CCA, and you can see here the different A, right? Not only the ink. So this is perhaps contemporary with the main text. The space between lines allows for interlinear glossing. The margins are occupied by sparse glosses. And you can see that this becomes customary in manuscripts from Fleury. This is the Vatican manuscript, where there are also glosses, both interlinear and marginal. The consecration comes actually only after 870 and above all around 900. This is a commented copy that was made, I think, in Reims or Laon, although everybody says Köln. I haven't found any interest in the Consolatio in Köln. I think it comes from Reims and Laon. It's Harley manuscript 3095 at the British Library. Now you can see how it was ruled with the double ruling here to accommodate a very ample space of glossing here. You see what space was left between the lines to accommodate interlinear glosses. The Consolatio is becoming a school text. And I think that when you study any other text, you also look at the layout and at these codicological elements which show you the purpose of the book. If you study the layout of manuscript Vatican Latin 3865 from the third quarter of the 9th century, you see that you have double through lines that separate the block from the outer and the inner margins. So glosses were meant on both sides. It's almost like the glossa ordinaria of law and biblical manuscripts later on. So it becomes a school text. You see it here also in this Trinity College 037 manuscript from Cambridge, a commented Anglo-Saxon copy. Ample margins. Here also in this University Library KK 321 manuscript from Cambridge as well. And you see the successive layers of glosses. Around 900, or this is later, but this appears around 900, in St. Gallen and only there, they start collecting the glosses. they copy them alone with the lemata, perhaps to recopy them into further books, into new copies of the book. So you have only the glossae collectae, only the collected glosses from such manuscripts. You see here, this is the same St. Gallen family of glosses. Here they gloss the text. This is the beginning, Carmina qui condam studio Florente Peregi. And here you have Carmina qui Q. This is Carmina qui condam studio. Now, studio is also glossed in German cryptograph. This is actually German Flisse with a consonantic cryptograph where K stands for I, Z, and F stands for E, right? So they put the next consonant for the previous vowel. B for A, F for E, K for I, and so on, right? P for O. Why did they gloss Old High German in cryptograph? Bernhard Bischoff studied this type of cryptograph. Well, I think because they were not allowed to use German in education there. Although, as you can see, as you will see in St. Gallen, German becomes dominant around 1000, the year 1000. So it was still something very marginal. So when they put German, they put it in cryptograph. Or perhaps just to make a difference, but they would know it because they were native speakers. All right, so you see id est doctrina, and you see that the German gloss is actually glossing the Latin gloss. Carmina que condiam studio id est doctrina, but actually flisse, flies, is a gloss of studium, namely of doctrina, and so on. So this becomes a staple school text in the 9th century. One of the questions we have to ask when we see early Boethius manuscripts is, are those manuscripts that we have school copies or library books? My idea now is that all of these are library books, because the school books would have been so worn out that they would have been discarded sooner or later. Perhaps with the exception of Orléans, but Michael Lapidge draws attention to the pristine state in which most so-called Anglo-Saxon school books survive. And indeed, it's enough to go to your local university library and to see in what state the school texts that we give as compulsory bibliography to our students are. And imagine now a manuscript from the 9th century. They all look pristine. That means they weren't used much. Gernot Wieland thinks that school books should have a few things to distinguish them. Accents for loud reading, and especially for people who are not native in Latin, like especially the Germans, right? Germans or Englishmen. Perhaps the French and the Italians still knew how to stress Latin words. Accents, syntactical and metrical glosses, generally in the form of A, B, C, D to reconstitute the ordo naturalis. Q glosses, quare hoc, in which the teacher is asking, so why is this? Why is he saying that, right? So the quare hoc glosses. And of course, the passages that would have been read and analyzed in class would be more heavily glossed. But I think that Rosalind Love, who studies the Cambridge tradition of the Consolatio, is right to say that the accumulation of marginal glosses happens for its own sake, and that these editions that have survived are the equivalent of our annotated scholarly editions. And actually, they have a new commentary, they paste it in, they just recopy it, and this is why you have several layers of glosses, as perhaps you already know from what you are studying in other traditions. Well, some of these are obviously library books. You see that from the stately deluxe quality of the books. Others are library books with the glossical circumscription, with the glosses copied next to it by the main scribe or immediately thereafter, but certainly they were meant to circulate together. It's also a luxury book. Other texts have different types of glosses. Sorry, let me... let me make sure I have switched off. I have muted all of you. Mute all. All right, all mute. I'll be back. You have morphological glosses, accentual glosses, syntactic glosses. They are called paving or construe letters, reconstituting the ordo naturalis. You have interrogative glosses, as said. Here are some examples from this Cambridge manuscript. You have both Latin's cilicet id est glosses, but also vernacular glossing, rinde for costicemque. For some reason, they needed to gloss this in Latin. And you can see here the syntactical glosses, A, B, E, right? This is B actually, A, B, right? So, or G is this is G. So they are glossing tu mila sensi inquit cum verba nostra tacitus attentus querapiebas, and it tells you how you should understand it in the natural syntactical order. When they have a continuous interlinear gloss, it also functions as a juxta. Sometimes you have Glossenglossierung, as the Germans put it in a very nice German word. I love the German capacity of making such words. Glossenglossierung. You have the vernacular glossing the insular. But here there is something interesting I noted. The cilicet sapientia comes after the seo. Seo is Old English for illa, she, the, die in German, right? So the article for the feminine, but you have seos cilicet sapientia, which shows that the Old English gloss comes first. Generally, the vernacular gloss is the Latin gloss. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? This is Old English mostly, but sometimes you have Latin glossing Old English as well. You can have rhetorical glosses. For example, here it says in bad Greek, exomologisis, apokrisis, brachylogia, and so on. So you also have rhetorical glosses in this Harley manuscript. As already said, you have Glossenglossierung in German, in cryptograph, and here is an example in which you have Leiche glossing modos, but actually not modos, but carmina. That's very interesting because carmina glosses modos, modos is carmina, and then Leiche, lei, gloss is actually carmina, right? Mestos, modos in the beginning of the Consolatio. So quite a complex thing going on there. Now this is the merely formal aspect. Let's move on to the conceptual philosophical aspect of glossing Boethius in the early medieval schools. As you all know, Boethius was made of a saint by Dante. He places him in paradise. He says, Lo corpo della fu cacciata giace giuso in ciel d'auro ed essa da martiro e da esilio venne a questa pace. Namely, Boethius came to this peace from martyrdom and banishment. The fact that he was killed by Theodoric, actually at the order of Theodoric the Great, made Boethius seem a martyr to the early Middle Ages and from then on. And very symbolically, Boethius's tomb is placed in the famous and beautiful church of San Pietro in Celdoro in Pavia, actually under the tomb of Saint Augustine. They're in the same church, Boethius in the basement and Saint Augustine on top of him. So you see, what a splendid metaphor. Corpus Sancti Severini Boeti Martiri. You see, it says on this tomb stone. However, Boethius was not really the most Catholic and Christian or a patristic author either. he was a philosopher, and the medievals were not duped. They realized that pretty early in the tradition, and this is what Beauveau from Corvée writes in 916 in a commentary on the famous Oqui Perpetua, book 3, meter 9. He says, Quisquis illorum Boetii versum intelligentiam indagare cupit, in primis admonendus est non solum in his versibus, sed in multis locis eius dem operis, quod Consolationis Philosophiae titulo prenotator, quedam catholice fidem contraria reperiri. Mind you, you will find something that is contrary to the Christian, to the Catholic faith, right? If you study the Consolation of Philosophy. This is what Beauveau is warning. And of course, if you look just at the discussion of Boethius, is not only at Oqui Perpetua, we'll come to that too in a moment, but to his discussion, for example, of fate, providence, and so on, there are indeed Neoplatonic elements there that may or may not be compatible with Christianity, but they are certainly not the doctrine of the fathers of the church in any case. This is a passage from Book 4, Prose 6, in which Boethius speaks about the relationship between fate and providence. And he says that the generation of all things and the whole development of changeable natures and whatever moves in any matter are given their causes, order, and forms from the stability of the divine mind. That mind, firmly placed in the citadel of its own simplicity of nature, established a manifold manner in which all things behave. And this manner, when it is contemplated in the utter purity of the divine intelligence, is called providence. But when related to those things it moves and disposes, it was by the ancients called fate. Now, Boethius says, fatum aveteribus appellatum est, aveteribus philosophies, obviously. So it was called fate by the ancient philosopher, by the ancients. In other words, he still accepts the term of fate. And he says it's one understanding of the working of divine providence, which is, of course, compatible with Christianity at all times, but it's also Neoplatonic and shows the same hierarchic thinking. And this is why I think that this presentation was a bit more relevant for the project that you have on Neoplatonism than Transylvanian fragments. Now, as you all know, in the cosmogony of Timaeus, the demiurge first created the gods and then gave them the fatus laws. Plato says, nomus tetus heimarmenus eipen autais, right? And this is what he says in the laws. When changing, man does so according to the order and the law of fate. Meta balonta de feretai katatentis heimarmenes taxin kai nomon, right? He changes according to the ordaining of heimarmene, of fate. For Apuleius, providence is divine decision, a warden of prosperity, divina sententia conservatrix prosperitatis, and fate is the divine law through which are accomplished God's inevitable decisions. So fatum est divina lex, right? Per quod inevitabiles cogitationes Dei complento. This is the actual origin of Boethius's thought. It's Neoplatonic, not Christian. This is what Plotinus says in the Aeneid. Endec panton kai pronoia mia heimarmene de apotu heironos arxamene, right? To de hyperano pronoia monon. So of all things proceeds one single being, and there is one providence beginning from the inferior things. It is in the first place fate, destiny. In the superior ones, it's providence. So obviously the Platonic hierarchical thinking. Chalcidius, in his commentary to Plato, says, Iuxta Platonem precedit providentia sequitur fatum. Boethius makes allowance for a whole series of fatal agents interposed between divine providence, the simplicity of divine providence, and man's destiny. He says that providence works fate through anima, well, that's the Platonic anima, tota inserviens natura, celestibus siderum motibus, angelica virtute, demonum varia solertia, right? So the demon's ingenuity, angelic power, the motion of celestial stars and so on, right? All of this, again, coming from the Platonic line of thought. You find the same ideas, for example, in Proclus de Decem Dubitationibus circa Providentiam, where he says, commodo et angeli providere dicuntur et demones iautem velis et heroes et anime cum his condispensantes cum diis mundum, right? So angels and all the other, the souls, all of them participate in the providential order of the world. Now, did the Carolingians note this not entirely Catholic thought? Yes, they start noting it pretty early. At first, they are certainly interested in providence and fate. When Boethius speaks about divinis spiritus, divini spiritus, they say, they add an interpretatio Christiana. They said spiritus sapientiae et intellectus, spiritus consili, etc. So they don't understand what spirits Boethius is talking about. But sometimes they realize that what he's saying is not really what they know from their Catholic doctrine. And this is once again the gloss. This is one of the very rarest glosses in the long manuscript. Mira de providentiae fatus, something strange about providence and fate. It takes a little to find actual glosses where they realize that what Boethius is saying is not Catholic. This is a manuscript from the St. Gallen family, Munich, 18765, in which the gloss says, hic mentitur de fato quia Dei ordinatio temperat cuncta. He lies about fate because it's actually God's order that moderates everything, right? The first critical positions appear in the second half of the 9th century, also in St. Gallen manuscripts. And here you also have the first auctoritates, as you will see in a moment. Fatum vero nil est, sed omnia per Dei nutum fiunt ver permittuntur fieri. There is no such thing as fate. Everything happens only through God's will, right? This is a St. Gallen manuscript today in Naples. Or the same gloss almost in St. Gallen Stiftsbibliothek 845 from the beginning of the 9th century, the 10th century, sorry. Fatum vero nihile sed omnia per Dei nutum fiunt permittuntur fieri. The beginning of the exegesis, however, of an actual exegesis appears in France around the year 900 with the so-called Remigian family of glosses, which to my mind is an accumulation of successive layers of teaching Boethius in Auxerre, where before Remigius you have Éric d'Auxerre and others. And the Remigian gloss, for example, here says, with also auctoritates, nota fatum nihil esse ut beatus Gregorius, and someone else, another hand, perhaps you can see it very here, the manuscript picture I have is not perfect, because the British Library wouldn't put perfect pictures online for some strange reason. But anyway, if you see the original, you will see that someone added et Augustinus, right? So they already have two sources for this gloss. Nota fatum nihil esse ut beatus Gregorius et Augustinus aliique dicunt, sed quod providentia Dei disponente foris agitur fatum vocatur. So once again, the interpretatio Christiana, there is no such thing of fate, but you can accept it as an aspect of providence, as Augustine and Gregory say. What do Augustine and Gregory say? This is what they say. Augustine says in De Civitate Dei, divina providentia regna constituuntur humana, quae si propterea quisquam fato tribuit, quia ipsam Dei voluntatem vel potestatem fati nomine appellat, sententiam teneat linguam corrigat. If someone thinks that this is fate, because he attributes it to God, let him correct his language, namely not call it fate, but he may stick to his opinion, which is correct because ultimately he ascribes it to God's divine providence. But linguam corrigat, you shouldn't be using the name fate. And this is what Gregory also says in his homilies, said absit ad fidelium cordibus ut esse aliquid fatum dicant. They shouldn't say that fate is anything. Only the creator of the world administers man's life. Man was not created for the stars, and then you know the typical argument. They, in the so-called Remigian glosses, which appear in this late 9th, early 10th century manuscript from, I think, also Reims, now in London, they say, hoc in loco quidam conati sunt Boetium reprehendere quasi hereticum dicente silum mathematicam sectaria docere omnia sub fato stellarum fieri. Some people thought that Boethius was a heretic and so on, because he was teaching that fate determines everything. The same thing here. Now, after all this scholarly tradition in the 9th century, around 900, we also have full vernacular translations of the Consolatio, and the earliest one is into Old English. The Old English scholar, whoever translated it under the patronage of King Alfred of Wessex, obviously simplified the philosophical notions and generally operated a mild interpretatio Christiana. For example, de providentiae simplicitate, de fati series, de repentinis casibus, de cognitione ac predestinatione divina, de arbitrii libertate are all simplified. For example, repentinis casibus is translated in Old English, veas ieberie, what happens by chance. Fati series is translated by Wyrd, the ultimate archilexeme of Old English for fate. Foreshowing goddess providentiae simplicitas is translated by the foreshowing, the foresight of God. Foretiohum predestination, and arbitrii libertate, men's freedom, as you can easily tell here. This is a much more courageous approach of simplifying and at the same time translating into the local how should I say, common day language, than what was being operated in St. Gallen. In St. Gallen, Notker Teutonicus, the father of the German language, as he is sometimes called, also translated the Consolatio around the year 1000. But what he is doing is what the Germans call Mischprosa, actually a mixture of Latin and Old High German, in which he is glossing and explaining, sometimes in German, sometimes using the original Latin words, as you would do today when you teach and you say, you know, now we are talking about fatum, and now this is providentia. So he's keeping the notions in Latin. Example, de simplicitate providentiae, dar ist anzufragene, there you have to ask, derogotes slechtum providentiae, and you see how he says about God's simple providentiae. It doesn't translate the German word, the Latin word into German. He says, you have to ask here about God's simple providentia. Sie ist schlecht, sie ist schlecht, schlechthin. It's simple, und Einfalt, and simple, und ungleich mannes providentia, and unlike man's providentia. You see how he is keeping. Von dies menis con providentia, das wir heißen Vorredachte und Bewahrung. And finally, he translates the word after he has explained it in German. So it's really the scholastic approach. You see a teacher here doing this. Das wir heißen Vordacht, Vorredacht, Vordacht, Forethought, as in Old English, und Bewahrung and providence, right? Notker is also doing something very interesting, and you see there the teacher at work. He's replacing in his, this is the German manuscript, the earliest extant manuscript of Notker's translation. It gives you the Latin first, but it places it in the ordo naturalis, so the syntax is rearranged to follow the German understanding. For example, Carmina qui quondam studio Florente Peregi, the famous beginning of the Consolatio, becomes qui per regi quondam carmina florente studio, right? So you see it's rearranged, and then he starts second, translating it, and then commenting on it. So you see actually that this translation is a tetrad work. The Old English one doesn't seem to have all that. That's one further argument, and I'm going to make it this summer in an Oxford conference. My argument is that the English translation doesn't stem from a constant engagement with the Consolatio over almost a century, like Notker's, right? Where you see the teacher at work in a school tradition. It's certainly under courtly patronage and rendered into an Old English, which is much more, how should I say, less scholastic, less self-conscious, or more self-conscious perhaps, more independent than the German is. At times, the Old English translator of the text comes out of the text and argues against the text that he is translating, against Boethius. This is incredibly funny. He says, here he translates Boethius, some philosophers say that fate rules, but I say, as all Christians say, that divine providence rules them, not fate, right? So he comes out of the text and says, ich donne sece sva eale Christene men sece, that's your God kunde fortio from his walde nas you word, right? So he comes out of the text and argues against the text in a way like a glossator, but without showing all that scholastic approach that you have in Notker. I'm going to skip over this. Now, when you have the passages that vex the Old English translator, he doesn't stop to explain and translate them like Notker. He just Christianizes them and passes over them. The anima, the Platonian anima, becomes mona saula, men's soul. Whereas Notker, sorry, what is this? Anima scilit mundana ut exponit commentator. So this is a later commentary drawing on William of Conches, and you see here what type of anima Plato is, Boethius has in mind. Sometimes the Old English translation depends on images in the margins of manuscripts. Images can function as glosses, triggering a translation, and that's very interesting. Boethius compares the working of fate and providence to the spinning of concentric circles. The center is God's unmoved simplicity and stability, and then the wider circles are the workings of fate. And of course, the wider the circle, the more it spins, right? The more you spin on the orbit. And those people that are farther from God are more affected by the workings of providence, he argues. Now, this image, this Boethian image, becomes the image of a homespun cartwheel in which you have the center, the axle tree, which is God, of course. But then the Anglo-Saxon, the Old English translator also invents a series of spokes on which men go up and down, as on Jacob's well, if you wish, or on the ladder of John Climax, right, up and down, depending on how sinful or pure they are. And this, in most manuscripts, the representation of the orbis of Boethius is this one with concentric circles. But in some manuscripts, as for example in this very crucial Vatican Latin 3363, as I argue in an essay, you can see where the Old English translator may have drawn his idea about spokes, which is very visual, isn't it? And of a wheel, because in some manuscripts you actually have drawings that look very much like wheels. As Nicholas Trevett said about the Old English Boethius, King Alfred treats his comparison differently in his English version by applying this also to men whom he divides in three categories, assimilating them to a wheel with three circles, the nave representing God. Another category comprises mediocre men who are more completely subjected to fate, and these are assimilated to spokes. So Nicholas Trevett, who was actually used by Chaucer and who used William of Conches, was also aware of the Old English tradition. That's very interesting that someone who lived so late should still read in the Old English of 900, but that's a different discussion that I don't have the time to enter upon here. Now, let me show you how the two translators work, and with that, I'm going to close in 5 minutes, I hope, so as not to bore you to death, all of you, and make you hate me more than you actually do for wasting your Friday evening, afternoon. The most famous passage in the Consolatio is obviously book 3, meter 9, O cui perpetua, the famous poem that was sometimes glossed separately. In some manuscripts, they just gloss it alone on 3 pages. So long have the commentaries become in the tradition already in the 9th century, but by the time of scholastic philosophy, they are really very, very long. Now, this is also purely Platonic. O qui perpetua mundum ratione gubernas terrarum celique sator qui templus abevo irre iubes stabilisque manens das cum timoveri quem non externe pepulerum fingere cause materie fluitantis opus verum insita summi forma boni livore carens. O you who govern the universe, creator of heaven and hell, who bid time ever move and resting still grant motion to all else, whom no external causes drove to make, you work your work of flowing matter, but the form within yourself of the highest good, ungrudging, and so on. Now, this in the Old English translation is instantly Christianized. Eala mindrichten that thou art allmächtig. The Old English rhyme reads, "Oh, my Lord, you who are almighty." There is nothing of the kind in that. Mighty, high-minded, and so on, and amazing and wonderful. You, eternal God. And you see, O qui perpetua ratione gubernas, and so on, all of this becomes expressly Christian with actually syntax phrases borrowed from famous Old English poetry, such as Cadwan's hymn reported by Bede in his ecclesiastical history. Here he actually takes words from the Nicene Creed. So there is this interpretatio Christiana at work in the Old English translation. Now, this is what the tradition of Boethius looks from around 800 or 782, when he was rediscovered in the European West, and around the year 1000 with Notker Teutonicus. An engagement of the text, a first philosophical understanding of the text, vernacular renditions, poetic also renditions in Old English. To look at this tradition, I started with Chaucer's Nun's Priest's Tale for fun's sake, of course, not for other purposes. Chaucer draws on his own translation of Boethius, which draws on the Nicholas Trevett's glosses, but also on the French translation of the Consolation made by Jean de Meun. Nicholas Trevett depends, as you all know, on William of Conches, who depends on Remigius of Auxerre on the manuscripts that I have shown you, like Harley 3095. But Trevett also depends on the Old English translation attributed to King Alfred the Great. Remigius of Auxerre depends on other early Carolingian and Ottonian commentaries made before him, who ultimately gloss on the Consolation of Philosophy. But those commentaries, of course, also draw on Augustine and Gregory the Great, and Boethius ultimately draws on Plato, Plotinus, and belongs to the same sphere of thought as Pseudo-Plutarch, Proclus, and the other Philosophiae Veteres. This is the tradition that goes into this, and of course, at some points, they all refer to the Bible. Although in the case of Boethius, this is rather limited, I should say, much more in the Opuscula Sacra than, of course, in the Consolatio Philosophiae. So what are they doing to Boethius in the Middle Ages? How did they know him? Well, some of them knew him directly in the original. Others knew him directly in the original with someone's glosses and commentaries through a gloss darkly, as some scholars put it in titles. Indirectly through quotations, commentaries, or as common knowledge. Indirectly in translation, as is the case of the Old English. Indirectly as unacknowledged sources, and so on. Chaucer can caricature Boethius. He was certainly read in the Carolingian school. He was certainly glossed. He was certainly commented on. He was quoted and misquoted by such scholars as Alcuin and Theodulf, for example, translated several times before the year 1000, adapted, adopted, used in fiction, confuted, remembered, plagiarized, and there Dragos has written about Dietrich von Freiberg, but there are Carolingians too who plagiarize him. All right, now that's just a survey, a very quick overview of this, and I'm done for today. Let's finish with the cock and the fox as a reminder of what happens to you if you listen to your wife, and of course, if you don't know Boethius well enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adrian, for this wonderful talk.
I hope I'm not completely irrelevant for what you're doing.
Look, you said it, but actually we had various guests or various topics within this context where we also had, I don't know, people who were not interested at all in philosophy and had talks on manuscripts very widely, and we'll have next week other guests, and in a couple of weeks other guests who will work mainly on manuscripts and glosses and tradition of manuscripts without necessarily referring to philosophy and even less to Neoplatonism. So nothing is irrelevant as long as we deal with medieval thought in a very broad sense, understood. I have I want to thank you again for this the very informative and extremely rich paper that you gave. I have a few questions. I think I have 3 or 4 questions. I probably ask them if others do not want to come first. There's also a privilege to be co-host, I suppose, because you are the host now.
Do you want to become a co-host? No, don't worry.
No, it's fine. No, I was just kind of making fun.
Because I'm recording and I can't pass on the hosting.
Yeah, that's fine. There's no worries. So I probably asked them as I wrote them down, these notes, marginal notes that I have. So my first remark was, or it concerned the let's say, first half of your talk, when you were describing these very few glosses that you've presented to us. I was a bit puzzled by the fact that, or probably I did not understand what you wanted to say. I was puzzled by the fact that you were somehow supposing that the lack of glosses is due to the layout of the text. I say
in
that
some of them, in some manuscripts,
in
yeah.
some manuscripts.
All right.
Because, well, if you are working with, let's say, notebooks of scholars in the 13th century, you rarely have manuscripts bare for glosses, right? And still they find they find a way to mark down what they want to mark down.
Yeah, but that was not the point. The point is the other way around. When they start making the layout, ruling the manuscript to accommodate glosses, it shows that they already have a tradition that they want to copy. It's not the other way around. It's not that they didn't write glosses because they had no space. but it shows the layout of the early manuscripts shows that they were not meant to accommodate glosses from the very beginning.
Right. No, that's clear, I think. What I wanted to say, why don't we have glosses, later glosses on these manuscripts? I mean,
because perhaps they no longer use them. They copied
So
new ones in the 12th. Do you know how many codices Boethiani there are? There are 120 manuscripts of the Consolatio Philosophiae before the 12th century. So before you start being interested. 120 before 1100. How many are there altogether? Hundreds, if not thousands. So they recopied it very often. Also, Dragos, and this is why I mentioned school books. Maybe there were other early manuscripts, school books, that were actually so worn out that they were discarded, thrown away, they disappeared, they weren't kept. These were library books, I think, all of them, and this is why they survived so well.
Yeah, so exactly. So this is well, where I wanted to come. Probably the lack of glosses is due to the fact that those were actually library books, so they wouldn't be allowed to take notes.
Because you see, some of them do. No, my argument is like this. What we have is a sampling of what existed, right? You had 20 manuscripts in Fleury, 10 of them were used in teaching by different teachers with different layers of glosses. But you also had library ones. If you had a lot of manuscripts and a few survive, I should put it the other way around. If you have 4 surviving manuscripts from Fleury, you must surmise that there were many more that have disappeared. If you have none from somewhere, well, perhaps they had one, perhaps they didn't. That's point number one. Second, if they have early manuscripts with no glosses, of course, they may in parallel have had a school tradition, but it's very unlikely. And when you see statistically through the ages that glosses start accumulating and the layouts change to accommodate the glosses, I think the point is that there is more scholarly engagement with the text itself, right?
That's right.
So it's like placing a sampling in the soil, and this is what you dig out and you start.
Sure. Where I wanted to come was, do you find, well, comparing once again the lack of glosses for these manuscripts and the change of the layout, can you say if there's a certain number of glosses that are repeated over and over again?
Yes.
I mean, do we have standard glosses? Because if you compare the layout on the one hand and the fact that some glosses are copied together with, well, within the same, standardized layout, you can draw some conclusions of that. And I think somehow you responded or anticipated my question when you show this, the wheels, the fact that the wheels, some wheels were kind of repetitive and copied in some, and other kinds of wheels were drawn in other manuscripts and so on. Did you try to combine all these elements together and see if you find a certain conclusion? Like, we have school books that would use the drawing of the wheel in a certain way, whereas other glosses were copied with other wheels.
Sometimes it's idiosyncratic. I have been through all the 120 manuscripts. Many of those wheels are dry point. Why are they dry point? Perhaps they meant to draw them in ink afterwards. Perhaps they didn't want to have them there at all, so they just made them dry point so as not to be visible. Sometimes they are idiosyncratic. For example, in the tradition from Orléans, you have them. Let me go back to it again for a second. And then I'll answer your question more.
This one.
You see, am I sharing?
Yeah.
This is the Orléans. Now, if Vatican Latin 3363 was also copied in Fleury, as I argue, and I wrote about it several times, and other scholars maybe agree with me, The question is, why do you have wheels here and circles here? Now, this is the standard one. This is actually true to what Boethius is saying, concentric circles spinning around an axis. You shouldn't be surprised to find this one. Bern also may come from Fleury, but you see in St. Gallen, you also have this. In other manuscripts from various, these are dry points, so I drew them on the computer. And then also in St. Gallen family, which should look like these ones, you see like St. Gallen 844 or München, you have this. In Vatican, so sometimes I think they are idiosyncratic. You see this one from München, which is erased. Well, we have others. I haven't shown all of them to you. Actually, there are more complex ones. But anyway.
But so you don't have, you can't find both diagrams in the same manuscript.
No. It's either one or the other. So it's either the wheel or the circles. You don't have two of them.
I see, okay.
In the KK, this is the only manuscript. Now, can you see there is a little something there? Can you see there is another one here?
Yes.
There is a third one in dry point that you can't see somewhere over here.
Right.
So maybe there they drew, but it's actually the same thing, you see.
Yeah.
So they are drawing it here and
so
here.
What you say is that we actually have different traditions.
Yes. You have
not only of
main traditions.
Right. Okay.
So you have the insular one, which develops after 900. You have the early Fleury one, which is not at all constant, actually, and which becomes gradually the central French one, Auxerre, and it ends up with the so-called Remigian commentary after Remis d'Auxerre. And you have the St. Gallen tradition. Apart from these, so let's say Central French, St. Gallen, and later on Anglo-Saxon, you have glosses that you can find the same gloss in different manuscripts from different areas. Sometimes you don't know where the manuscripts come from. Sometimes they are idiosyncratic. But if you follow the St. Gallen tradition, which is very easy to follow and consistent, you can see that the earliest manuscripts, which are generally little glossed, and I refer to Naples, where is the Naples? 4G68. You see here, you have here and there a few glosses. This is an early manuscript. I wrote that the gloss here is from the second half of the 9th century, but the manuscript is from the first half. Now here you have a few glosses. These glosses develop up to the age of Notker. They reuse the same glosses. For example, you saw this Fatum vero nihil est. Here is a 10th manuscript saying exactly the same thing, Fatum vero nihil est, right? So the same gloss, the St. Gallen family of glosses. But there too, there are idiosyncratic things. One manuscript adds a new gloss. Sometimes there are cross references. You find glosses from the Remigian tradition in the St. Gallen tradition. You find St. Gallen glosses in the insular tradition. So obviously they circulated. There are constellations of glosses. Now, a professor from Oxford, Malcolm Godden, together with Rosalind Love from Cambridge and other collaborators, have been editing all these early medieval glosses for the past 10 years now, or even more. And apparently a very huge edition is going to come out soon. It's been announced for a few years now. When that comes, we may have a clearer idea about how all these glosses move. In one article I wrote, I argued that there is actually no such thing as a Remigian commentary, but there are constellations of glosses that grow, they use previous work. Some of them disappear, some of them are copied over and over again, some are enriched. You saw that hand adding et Gregorius, et Augustinus, and then the next time it would be copied with Gregory. So you see actually the growth of the tradition, but there is certainly a growth. So from sparsely glossed manuscript to heavily glossed manuscripts like
Right. So
this one.
they have a life of their own, the glosses,
Yes.
actually. So this somehow answers my question about how influential these glosses were. So I think we kind of understand that. But now this comes to my, let's say, what I had as a third question, the relationship with the vernacular translation. So do I understand correctly that, so how shall we understand it? This interpretation Christian that you mentioned, is it due to the fact that they wanted to simplify the text, which was already, well, those are not easy concepts to understand, even for someone who has a philosophical background? Or so on the one hand, did they try to simplify in order to make it more kind of accessible to the vernacular, well, to the public? Or was it, as you tried to emphasize, um, a clear decision behind the translation in order to make it more Christian, to sound more Christian to the ears of the
Yes,
public? I mean,
I think it's, yeah, yeah. I think it's both of these. So actually, you see that there is a different approach. Notker, who is working within the St. Gallen tradition and has all that tradition of glossing behind him, is addressing an audience. And this is, I would say, receptionstheorie, as we say in literary studies. Who is the intended audience? For
right.
Notker, the intended audience is St. Gallen scholars, his pupils, to whom he is putting the Latin, and the purpose is the Latin text, the understanding of the Latin text, not a continuous and fluent German translation. He's not interested in that. He wants his pupils to understand the Latin text. So he is putting the Latin words in the natural order, then he is glossing, explaining, and finally translating. And you see, that is the approach. In the Old English one, the intended audience is what King Alfred said in a programmatic letter, all the free men that are now in England. And this is why he launches a translation program. There are translations from Augustine's Confessions, Soliloquies, from Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, Orosius's Universal History, the Psalter, Gospels, all kinds of texts are being translated, and the Consolation of Philosophy, right? So the fact is that I think he has in mind a general public of young aristocrats, all free men that are now in England and who have the leisure to read. It's a program of instruction for the general public. And this is something unprecedented in around 900. Can you imagine such a thing where they were in 900 in Wessex, intending a translation of several important works, theological, philosophical, historical, and biblical, for an audience. And this is why he's simplifying also, because his audience is not an audience of scholars engaged in glossing texts, but a more or less general audience. That's
right. So
what
yeah. So it's obviously he couldn't present a text which wasn't like kind of appropriate for the audience in both ways, complicated and non-Christian.
Yeah.
But why would he decide to translate a text about which glosses already alert the reader? Careful, this is not always Christian. Careful, this is not what we see in the Bible. Why would someone decide to translate this text, knowing that we are already kind of alerted on some aspects?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Why did they choose? There are many arguments, actually. One of them is that King Alfred himself was interested in it because it talked about the fate of people in face of adversity, how people behave in front of adversity. And the first three books of the Consolatio are actually pretty stoic. The conclusion is omnia bona est fortuna. Any fortune is good, you take what comes, and that's it. Then it becomes Neoplatonic and much more philosophical in the fourth and fifth books, and the fifth one talks about predestination, foreknowledge, and all those complicated things. I think that the text had also become very popular in the early Middle Ages. This is what they would be reading there. Augustine, Gregory, Boethius. These were the 3, 4. And Boethius became so popular mainly, I think, initially as a school text for learning good Latin, because it has both prose and poetry. And the poetry has all types of metra, all types of meters, you know. So you could study all and rhetorical devices. And then the prose is both very beautifully written and philosophical. And moreover, it's not the difficult classical Latin of Virgil or something and entirely pagan, but it's a Christian, someone they regarded as a martyr, you see. Right. But they were still perplexed. How should they handle Boethius? Is he fully Christian? The opuscula sacra, the tradition that he was a martyr, make him a Christian. So yes, but then they realize that something is not perfectly in line with that thinking. So yes, they have these perplexities that they treat differently. King Alfred is making an overall interpretatio Christiana. For example, he eliminates Fortuna as a goddess who appears there. He calls her Wyrd, fate, and that's it. He unifies Fatum, Fortuna, Casus, all of those become Wyrd. That's something I wrote about in my dissertation. And then Fortune Dona, he just calls them the world's goods. Philosophia becomes wisdom, simply. Sophia tu Theu, right? Just wisdom, divine wisdom. So there is a conscious simplification and interpretatio Christiana going hand in hand. And also the prose is very fluent. You don't see the Latin underneath. But at times he comes out like a glossator, like a commentator, and argues against the text or adds something out of the text, right? So it's a fascinating text that he's creating there. Whoever did it, it was believed that it was King Alfred himself. Then Malcolm Godden, a professor at Oxford, wrote an article in which he asked, did King Alfred write anything? And I tend to agree with him. Would a king fighting against the Vikings, against the Danes around 900, 870, 80, have time to engage in the translation of the Consolatio?
Well, we have other cases where
we have other cases of kings who did that. Actually, yes. Queen Elizabeth I did, but she was not queen yet. And apparently
Julian the emperor was an emperor when he wrote a couple of philosophical texts, right? So, and he was dealing with others as well.
Maybe he did, but there also in the life of King Alfred that a contemporary wrote, although it may be apocryphal, Asser, he's reported to have been illiterate in his early period, so it's pretty unlikely, you know.
Marcus Aurelius, you have another emperor who
he was a scholar from the beginning. He was not illiterate. He was
but I mean, they had time to write and to fight.
Yes, well, maybe. Certainly things happened under King Alfred's patronage. Perhaps the Consolation was translated only a bit later. We still have to realize when it arrived to England. Did they have a tradition there? But if you compare the Anglo-Saxon extant manuscripts, I didn't have time to mention that. Most of them are made in Canterbury, but there are also others made in other places in England. But they're all late 10th century, all of them made after the Benedictine, not all, most of them copied, and the glosses, the family of glosses. So in parallel, but much later, no, I shouldn't say in parallel, much later than the vernacular tradition, there is what you find in St. Gallen earlier, right? So it's the other way around. They start with the vernacular tradition, and then in the 10th century, you see a scholarly engagement, as you saw in St. Gallen, the typical type of things. Whereas in St. Gallen, you first have the scholarly engagement, and it culminates with the vernacular translation. as you would expect, actually. Notker is around 1000 and the earliest gloss is around let's say 850, perhaps even earlier, right? Or perhaps even, well, anyway, mid-9th century to 1000.
I have one minor remark or minor question about this Seos Cicet Sapienza. Could you show it again, if you don't mind? This I had the impression that it's the same hand actually.
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay. So because I thought that you were saying that someone wrote it in German and then
Old English.
Sorry, Old English, and then someone added the
No, it's the same hand.
Same hand, right?
But he started, I should think, he started with the Old English word. It comes first. You see, here it is. Can you all see it?
Yeah.
Seo Scilicet Sapienza. Now, Seo is just on top of Ila. Yes, it's certainly the same hand. Yeah. Look also at the S. But then Seo dot Scilicet Sapienza. Scilicet Sapienza gloss is Seo. Don't you think so?
Yeah, but what do we have? I don't know. It's between the line between Seo and Ila. There's something like, what is that?
No. These are the syntactical letters. You see A. This is C. So he should start with, these are the syntactical glosses. Do you have that in later medieval manuscripts?
I'm not aware of any, probably in logic, but I'm not aware, this
is pretty frequent in the English manuscripts of Boethius. You see, you have all these letters here, K, okay. I, M, N, L, I.
B is, it's tung there, right?
Yeah, B is tum. Yeah, here is the B.
Okay, I see the tum, yeah.
Tum. So you should read like this. Inquit tum, asked then. You see, instead of tum illa sensi inquit comperba. This is the ordo naturalis. They tell you how to place the words. Inquit.
Oh, I understand.
The teachers of Latin among us know that this is what they are doing all the time when they read Latin. They first put them in the order in which you can understand it.
Yeah, sure.
Right? Inquit tum illa, answered, asked, right?
But why would someone add the Latin there if...
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Because perhaps this is my idea, perhaps they had in front of them a manuscript in which they already had the Latin glosses. Yeah. But Ila is not clear who is referred to by Ila, and the Old English Seo, she, doesn't tell you who the Ila is. And then it says Scilicet Sapientia, because wisdom discusses, namely, right?
Right, so probably someone had a model with a gloss or a gloss.
This gloss, however, is in a different hand than this Anglo-Saxon one.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
This is the perhaps earliest, and this one comes later. But they may be contemporary, just a different hand. Glossing Seo.
Yeah. Okay, I understand. Yeah, okay, it makes sense now to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So there are 3 layers of glossing there. 3, right? The syntactic glossing, the vernacular glossing, and this Scilicet. These are pretty rare in this manuscript, CCC 214. But
they even have to say 3 hands.
Yes, yes, or perhaps even more. These are different inks, as you can see here. Well, we should look at them attentively. No, this is the same hand all over the place. This insular hand. You see the G's.
Yeah, but the letters is I think there's another.
The letters may be a different.
A different hand, and then Sapienza.
Caroline. This is a Caroline hand. Now they were using both insular minuscule for Old English and insular Caroline minuscule.
Right.
So they even have, you see, this is, for example, insular Caroline. Look at the S.
Yeah.
Whereas look at the S here. No, here they also use an insular Caroline. but look at the G. Well,
Yeah.
Look at the D.
So actually, the text, well, the manuscript was read and circulated by at different stages, a different.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And also eaten by rats in this case.
Yeah, I mean,
Of the Corpus Christi College.
we can't blame them.
No, it was pretty delicious, I should think. Not only the
I mean,
text.
we're also reading.
Yes. Well, I've never eaten manuscripts, but
Not yet.
it's. I hope I never do, because that may land me into very bad trouble. So don't drive me into temptation. Yes.
So if there are other questions or remarks, I suppose that they might be. Yeah, Yuli.
Yes, I would like to say something, but not before. I want to thank Adrian for his lovely and very precious presentation. And I love that you insisted with reading in different languages, and that this really gave us the impression of the vast territoire of this Boethius tradition. And I was wondering if, in case of the Scilicet Scientia, was it?
Sapientia.
Sapientia, because I also have some manuscripts containing the Liber de Causis in England, and I have noticed this this practical glosses that insists on naming the pronoun.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think it's the Oxford gloss, but it could be a habit, an English habit that was perpetuated.
But not only. You also have it. We also have it in the Zangalan tradition. So wherever it's an article, it says Scilicet Sapientia, Scilicet Philosophy.
Yes, it's very probable.
So it's common. I don't think it's English or insular or particularly. I don't know. But in the case of Boethius, it certainly appears in the Zangalan tradition as well.
Yes, I just noticed my manuscripts were mainly from the English territory. And
Scilicet gloss is very frequent, interlineary, both explanatory and lexical glosses.
Yes, it should be very vague, and an explanation of this is just hypothetical. But I was wondering if the teachers from the 9th and 10th century chose Boethius as a school text. I was wondering if this was due to the fact that Boethius was the first translator of Aristotle, and then they were more connected, or they were more aware of this author, or I mean, they have more ancient texts in their libraries, or.
Well, Boethius was not only the author of Aristotle, also of De Musica. He wrote practically on the Trivium and Quadrivium. He wrote a book on arithmetics. He also, of course, translated the categories and so on. He was well known for the Opuscula Theologica, which consecrated him as a Christian writer, and above all for his reputation. But the most widely studied book was the Consolation of Philosophy. And I think the reason they chose it is because it gave you all types of Latin in one book. It gave you what they thought was Christian doctrine, ancient good language, a good standard of Latin, right? A good standard of a native writer of Latin, and different metra. That, I think, was decisive, because you had all kinds of meters that they could study in school, also for rhetorical purposes. So I think there are two traditions. When Alcuin mentions among the books extant at York, quod Victorinus scripsere, quod Boethius scripsere Victorinus et philosophy veteres, I think there he refers to the categories. but they didn't circulate. Generally, they seldom circulated in the same manuscript. Generally, the Consolation circulated with the Opuscula Philosophica or alone.
Okay.
Alone. In most cases, alone.
Yes, that was my main curiosity. Probably
Yes. I don't think that Aristotle was the reason why they chose him. I think it's because he had very nice Latin in both prose and verse, and this reputation of a saint, of a martyr.
Yes, makes sense.
I think so.
Well, the Consolatio was known, obviously, even in later period, but like 12th, 13th, 14th century. But
Yeah.
if you compare if you check the number of commentaries on Consolatio, you won't find that many actually.
You will. Well, there are very many. I'm not an expert in the late ones, but there is Trevet, there is William of Conches, and there are many others as well. There is a pseudo Scotus Eriugena that
yes, but in the 13th, 14th century,
edited.
In late scholasticism or scholasticism late, so you won't find that many actually.
There are several. I don't know them very well, but and it was translated several times into French, into Middle English.
It was read, definitely. It was read and
Catalan, all traditions.
Yes.
It was read and translated, and it passed into literature. It was common knowledge when they referred to faith and providence.
It was one of the texts that had a huge success, but commentaries in terms of like literally commentaries, like you had on the metaphysics or the physics and so on Aristotle, you have very few.
No longer one of the standard school books, I think.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
In your age.
Yeah.
14th, 15th.
That's sure, yeah.
But it's still one of the most copied texts.
Sure.
And I think I read this, but I shouldn't say something stupid, but I think that after the Bible and Augustine, Boethius is the third most copied text, the Consolation in the Middle Ages throughout. So yes, copied, translated. If you put in all the translations and the copies, there are thousands of manuscripts.
Yeah.
Italian, there are Italian commentaries. Then there are vernacular commentaries. There is a very long tradition, but I stop at 1200. The others are too modern for me, so I don't venture that far. Apart from Shakespeare, but that's my private pleasure, you know. All right. Yeah. Well, perhaps we shouldn't bore people to.
I don't think we do, but if I wouldn't.
If there are questions, of course, or comments.
Yes, if there are questions, Evan.
Hi. Yeah, just a quick question there. You may have touched on this already, but yeah, thank you for this wealth of information you've given us. When Dragos asked the question about the two images, the concentric circles and the wheels, it seems to me that the wheel image, of course, is a really interesting one to bring back when Boethius starts talking about fate and providence, because that, of course, recalls the earlier image of the Wheel of Fortune from early on in the text.
Yeah.
And then when you mentioned that the King Alfred translation, or the one that he commissioned, uses the same word to translate fate and fortune, it seemed to me that maybe that image is doing some kind of synthetic conceptual work by saying, well, what you previously thought of as fortune, now you kind of return to that discussion and think of it now within the context of this distinction of providence and fate that I'm giving you now later in the book. So it would be interesting to see whether there's a connection between the use of the wheel image at that point in the text and any kind of moves that the glosses make in terms of, you know, what they say about fate and its relation to fortune, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very good. Now, what I think happened there is generally they drew exactly what Boethius said, concentric circles, in most manuscripts. But in some of them, and I'll show you again so that you have it. In some manuscripts, those spokes were added, but you see, you still have the concentric circles here, for example, in this Einsiedeln copy. In this one, no, they don't go all the way down. Here too, so these two are a type. This here is a clearly stylized wheel. So now, did the drawer have the wheel of fortune in mind when he did that? That's the thing that I would pick from what you said. Maybe, because of course the image of the wheel of fortune appears in Boethius, and that consecrated it throughout the Middle Ages. They drew it from Boethius. Did he have that in mind, one of them, incidentally, and then they copied from each other and so on? Or was it just that they drew some spokes on concentric circles and they looked like wheels, and then they stylized it as a wheel, irrespective, independently of the previous discussion of wheels? Mm-hmm. I couldn't really tell. Generally, those drawings appear next to a commentary in which they explain the relationship, quoting Gregory and Augustine. Mm-hmm. And that's the elaborate commentary. But in earlier manuscripts, sometimes the wheel can appear alone with no gloss at all, which shows that they copied it from some other manuscripts, but they didn't want to gloss their own manuscript. So there are all kinds of situations, actually. Sometimes it's copied with it and they draw another one, you see in the Cambridge manuscript, but that's a very rare case. So to come back to it, no, I don't think that Alfred is using the wheel. By the time he comes to a translation of the wheel, he had already chosen how to simplify the text. He eliminates active Fortuna as a goddess and makes her just Fatum. Secondly, the human fortunae of people, my fortune, your fortune, he calls them the world dweller, the world well goods, right? Worldly goods. So they disappear altogether. So from the three senses of Fortuna, he gets rid of the goddess Fortuna active. He keeps the Fortuna equivalent to Fatum, what happens and so on, and gets rid of the third Fortuna, our Fortuna, and calls it world dweller. So he tries to get rid of what is very clearly pagan, the goddess Fortuna, in two ways, and keeps Fatum because there is this discussion, but then makes clear that you understand that Wyrd is subordinate to God's Vorausschauung, providence, and so on. But there he hesitates. For Wyrd, he doesn't hesitate. He always calls it Wyrd consistently, and he groups under Wyrd all the other possible fatalistic, so casus, repentini, casus, fortuitus, whatever is, he calls it Wyrd, fatum, fortuna, all those. But then for providentia, it's obvious that they don't have a word yet in Old English. So he hesitates. He sometimes calls it Vorausschauung, foreshowing, foresight, sometimes Voretjochung, which is predetermination, predestination, as it were, right? So he doesn't really know how to translate that. And there are inconsistencies. That's also something very interesting, showing what philosophical vocabulary they had available. But mind you, Boethius also created an Old English philosophical vocabulary because they didn't have any. And by translating him, they were forced to invent mana freodom for arbitri libertas and so on. I once thought, but unfortunately I think it's not true, that King Alfred invented the word freedom. Wouldn't it be beautiful to say the word freedom in English was invented by King Alfred the Great? Because they have a lot of occurrences. I looked up in the corpus, they have a lot of occurrences of freo, free, but freodom is relatively rare, but still I think now that it did exist before Alfred, and he didn't create the abstract freedom. But that's also a fascinating point. Freodom. Yeah.
Right. One last short question.
If need be, otherwise.
May I?
Yes,
May I ask one?
Okay.
All right. First of all, thank you for the lecture and for this wonderful insight in early medieval philosophy and literature. And I have a rather outsider's question. Professor Papahagi, you have used this collocation during your delivering of the lecture, this collocation of dry point when related to the manuscripts and I don't know, to the way that they were written, if I understood correctly, a dry point. Could you explain us a little bit what is a dry point in a manuscript, please? Thank you.
Yes, certainly. Dry point is when you make you leave a trace on the manuscript without using ink, with the back of a knife or with any, with dividers, with any instrument, right? So it can refer to ruling, the ruling in the margins. I'll show you. The ruling in Carolingian times is always dry point. So it leaves a trace, but no color.
I see. So,
I'll show you in a moment, and you will see quite clearly.
It's for organizational purpose, if I understand correctly. It's organizational purpose within the page.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, if you look here very attentively, you will see the dry point here. Can you see a kind of faint line here?
Yeah. Yes, you're right.
So that's the dry.
Yeah, there is one. I see.
All right. Here it's less visible, but still you also see the prickings, the little holes.
Yeah, less visible. Yes, yes.
And sometimes here it's more visible in the light. Here, can you see it?
Yeah.
All right.
There is.
Sometimes you have dry point glosses, and that's very complicated. In the Cambridge KK 323 manuscript, which I should go back and see when I have time, if ever they let us circulate again. You see here very clearly the dry point lines here, the ruling.
It is visible.
But sometimes the entire drawing is in dry point and you can hardly see it. I don't know if and sometimes the glosses are scratched in dry point. And there are full editions of, there is a certain Herbert Dean Merritt and others who edited Old English dry point glosses. In manuscript Cambridge KK 323, there are very many of them. And some scholars claim that there are many more that can't be seen. I have seen the manuscript and you need good daylight to actually read them. They're really scratched. Why would they do that? Well, perhaps they were not allowed to use English in schools. They said, no, let's do everything in Latin. So they glossed the Old English almost